Welcome to episode 22. In this episode, we will discuss the character of Noah. We will continue through Genesis 6 and start into Genesis 7. We pick up right where we left off with the great depravity of man. Things were so bad that the thoughts of men's hearts were only evil continually. Genesis chapter 6 verses 5 through 8 outline the environment for the introduction of Noah. The verses read, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." Obviously, there's a lot of darkness in our world today. However, even now, I'm not sure we're at the point of every imagination and thought being only evil continually. So, things must have been rough. And obviously, God noticed. One thing that's interesting is that one detail that's in a lot of cultural flood legends is that the humans angered the gods. And that's more or less what we see here. Verse 6 says, "It repented the Lord that he had made man, and grieved him at his heart." The first phrase in this verse is an interesting concept. What does "and it repented the Lord" mean? Well, to me, it means there was some kind of deep internal movement of sorrow and disappointment. God is outside of time, which is something that we can't comprehend. He's in the past, present, and future. That being said, he is in the present, and he walks alongside and interacts with humanity. He is grieved by sin and disobedience, and pleased by humility and obedience. In fact, I was reviewing how other translations translated this verse, and a lot of them said something like the Lord felt sorry that he had made man. To me, using the word sorry is a little bit more clear in communicating the intended meaning of this verse. Some translations use regretted, but in our current context, I feel like that word is a little bit too negative. Although if understood properly, sorry and repented and regretted are all trying to communicate the same thing. The difference is just how people are inclined to interpret it. What I don't think is happening here is that God thought that he had made some kind of mistake, or he was surprised by the wickedness, or outmaneuvered by humans. My belief is that even though God does know the future, that does not mean that he can't have a responsive presence with us in our current moment. In fact, I think the very message of the gospel reflects this sentiment. For an individual who is unsaved or who has not surrendered to God, the outcome of their life will eventually be eternal destruction. However, if at any point they choose to change and to surrender to God, God has compassion on this decision and offers his grace and mercy, thus changing the projected outcome of this individual's life. And for each decision that person makes, either obedience or disobedience, God is grieved by disobedience and pleased by obedience. And generally speaking, in a free society, there are good consequences for good decisions and bad consequences for bad decisions. One thing that the Bible teaches is that God is a just God, and his decision for justice at this time was essentially to hit reset on humanity. There is precedent for this in other places in the Old Testament, however, obviously not at the scale of all of humanity. The children of Israel were wandering in the desert for 40 years, waiting for all of the old stubborn people to die, and also there was the Canaanite conquest. So there are some points of humanity where it's just more merciful to erase it all as opposed to allow it to continue. Does that mean that God is immoral? I don't think so, because one, all of our lives at any given moment are always in God's hands, and he allots us the appropriate measure of life and breath, no matter where we're at, or how he chooses to end it. And actually, I think this reflects more that humans are just that bad. And if there wasn't some kind of hard stop, there would be even more pain and more death and more suffering in the future if things were allowed to continue. You might think, well, that's sad, and it is. However, it is not my fault that other people choose to make bad decisions. Then in verse 8, we are introduced to Noah. Verse 9 describes Noah as a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. The Bible is very clear that Noah had a good character, but I have to wonder what that would have looked like on a day-to-day basis. Like, how did Noah conduct his daily life? And what did the environment that he was in look like? Verses 11 and 12 read, "The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth." My biggest personal question is, how do you stay righteous when everybody else around you is corrupt? Because obviously the people and systems around you influence you, and how do you participate in that without contributing to the corruption? This question probably comes more from my observations of our current cultural context. I just see how Satan works in our environment and culture to make evil and values that are contrary to God's word seem like the default or easiest option. The result of that is then that it's a lot easier to justify a compromise and go along with the world and be comfortable with the personal gain, as opposed to put forth the necessary effort required in order to actually have a lifestyle that is aligned with biblical values. My other question is, if the world was corrupt and violent, how did Noah manage to thrive without getting harmed or taken advantage of? This is extrapolation, but in order for Noah to have the resources and connections in order to do a large construction project like the ark, he would have had to been skilled and talented and probably wealthy or well connected, which that speculation kind of feeds back into my question as to how do you become wealthy and well connected in a corrupt system. But setting this speculation and extrapolation and imagination aside, we next move into God instructing Noah to build the ark. The Hebrew word for ark essentially just means a box, and the origin of the word ark itself comes from the Latin word arca, which means large box or chest. So God essentially told Noah to build a large floating box. Understanding the meaning of the word ark makes it understandable why the word is used in other contexts in the Old Testament, like the Ark of the Covenant, the box or the chest of the covenant, and when Moses was a baby discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, the word used for what he was floating in is ark. Noah had a wife and 3 sons, and his sons had wives, and God instructed Noah to build an ark so that they could survive the impending doom. Verse 22 reads, "Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, and so did he." This verse is actually a powerful expression of faith, because I'm guessing that Noah didn't fully understand what the outcome of all of this would be, or why building this box was necessary or the only way to do things. However, I'm sure once it was all said and done, everything all made sense in the end, but in the moment, he maybe would have had some unanswered questions. I think it is easy in our individualistic society to think that when we don't understand something that God commands in the Bible, that means we don't have to do it. But that's not faith actually, because faith is when we trust in God and live in obedience according to his commandments, even if we don't fully understand them in the moment or know what the outcome is going to be. We do this because even though we are limited as humans, we know that God is all-knowing and loving, and that the outcome that he is working toward is what's best for us, even if that's not what it seems like or feels like in the moment. And sometimes looking back at that experience, things do make more sense, though not always. So the moral of the story is that it is quite foolish to exalt our own logic and reasoning and wisdom and make determinations based on that, as opposed to what God says. It can be tempting to want to interpret the Bible in the way that makes you feel comfortable in the moment. However, that is not always the right way to go about things. So, as we will continue to see, Noah was blessed for his obedience, even though that obedience probably wasn't always easy. Easy in the sense of going along with human nature. Now, getting to the ark, there are a lot of questions that surround this topic. The initial ones are, how did Noah build the ark? How long did it take him to build the ark? How did all the animals fit on the ark? Were there dinosaurs on the ark? Did people even know how to build things back then? We will answer some of those initial questions here. First, we will talk about the construction of the ark. We don't have any specific details on the skills or abilities that the people had back then. However, I believe it is biblical to assume that they were capable of doing so. First of all, because God asked Noah to do it, it seems unreasonable to think that God would have asked Noah to do something that Noah was incapable of doing. And also, reading about other early humans, we find that they advanced in technology very quickly after the fall. Abel was a herdsman, Cain was a farmer, and it gives some details about Cain's descendants. Tubal-Cain was an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Jabal dwelt in tents and had cattle. Jubal was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. The Bible says we already had metalworking a few generations from Adam, so therefore I believe it is reasonable to assume that Noah had the necessary technology in order to build a large boat. Sometimes people even speculate that perhaps Noah's profession was shipbuilding. Even in the post-flood era, there is astounding evidence that shows how intelligent the humans were, whether it was construction of temples or cities or monuments, or the ability to read the stars, or travel across large bodies of water. Obviously, Noah and his sons would have had skills, and they would have passed them on to their descendants after the flood. Actually, it is more of an evolutionary assumption to believe that humans in the past were simple and unadvanced. And the reality is we are constantly finding evidence that disproves this assumption. The evidence consistently shows that humans were more advanced earlier than what the secular historians think. I mean, we don't even know how they built Stonehenge, and that's literally a few rocks stacked on top of each other, much less the intricately crafted temples that have been discovered. In Genesis 6 verse 3, God says, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. What this means is that at this point, there was 120 years until the flood. So, the construction of the ark would have lasted less than 120 years. Based off what the other verses say, answers in Genesis suggest that Noah would have built the ark in around 75 years. This assumption is derived from verse 18, where it suggests that Noah would have had his 3 sons, and they all would have been married by the time that God commanded Noah to build the ark. 75 years is a long time, and Noah could have hired people to help him with the construction. This is why we speculate that perhaps Noah could have been wealthy. 2 Peter 2:5 describes Noah as a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. We also assume that Noah would have been able to build the ark in a way that was conducive to preserving life for the duration of the flood. Answers in Genesis has done a lot of work on how this could be possible. If you want to know more details about the specifics, you can look into their resources. They show realistic mechanisms for how Noah could have collected fresh water, provided ventilation, stored food, removed waste, all the things that would be necessary in order to take care of the animals. Speaking of animals, how did all the animals fit on the ark? Genesis chapter 7 verse 9 reads, "There went in 2 and 2 unto Noah into the ark, the male and the female, as God had commanded Noah." So, most likely with divine assistance, the animals went unto Noah into the ark. Sometimes people will say that it would be impossible for every species on the planet to fit into the ark because there are millions of them. First of all, the classification of animals that Noah had on the ark was not species, but kinds. Quantitatively, this would have been significantly fewer. We talked about kinds in a previous episode. Also, marine animals would not have had to be on the ark because there was plenty of water for them to survive in. But aside from that, Answers in Genesis estimates that at most there would have been 6,744 animals on the ark, and their models show how this would be possible. For each animal there was male and female. However, for clean beasts and fowls, God gave more specific details to take more than just 2. Whether it was 7 of each kind or 7 pairs of each kind, modern Hebrew translators aren't certain. However, in the number that I just stated, the most possible animals were factored in to that calculation, which would be they assumed 7 pairs of each kind. How did the animals fit on the ark then? Because there's some large creatures out there. For this question, I think it is logical to believe that God would have done things in a way that is logical. And the logical assumption here is that the animals on the ark would have been juveniles. There are many advantages if this was the case. They would have been smaller, they would have eaten less, there would be less waste, they would be easier to manage, and they would have survived longer after the flood, maximizing their ability to reproduce. It is a lot easier to take care of a baby elephant instead of a full-grown elephant. It is easy for our minds to immediately fixate on large creatures and wonder how that could have worked, But the reality is, according to Ark Encounter estimates, only 15% of the animals on the Ark would have reached an adult mass of over 22 pounds. This means that a significant majority of the creatures on the Ark were pretty small. Lastly, a lot of times people ask, were there dinosaurs on the Ark? Dinosaurs only exist in fossils to us, and they can seem like unrealistic creatures in the distant past. However, just like dinosaurs were created with all the other land animals during Creation Week, dinosaurs would have also been on the Ark. And again, it makes sense for them to be in juvenile form. The reality is, the average size of the species that we identify as dinosaurs was about the size of an American bison, so they were generally smaller anyways. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 10, we arrive at the start of the flood. And this is where we will start next time. Unfortunately, I can't answer every specific or individual question about these topics. First of all, because that would be basically impossible, because I can't read every blog on every corner of the internet. And two, even if it was, it would take days. So hopefully I gave some good general guidance to give understanding on the basics. We will see you next time, and we will begin to explore the topic of the Great Flood.